Boating is no accident. Partly sunny with a stray shower, high 80 to 84. Patchy clouds and mild Friday night, lows in the mid-60s inland, 71 at the coast. Saturday, mostly sunny and warm, high 83 to 87. Sunday, partly sunny and very warm, high 84 to 88. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Joe Lundberg.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, you are in store for a real treat, and so are we. Our next guest has devoted a large part of his life to writing this huge book, and it's awesome. It's not only me saying that, it's a New York Times best-selling book. It's an Amazon best-selling book. It is called The Road Not Taken. Max Boot wrote the book. He's on the phone. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a journalist, a contributor to the New York Times, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Times. The Road Not Taken is Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam. Let me just read from the paragraph in the back of the book. This is what it says. A brilliant biography. Oh, this is a comment from General David Petraeus, of all people. Here's what he had to say. A brilliant biography of the life and a riveting description of the times of Edward Lansdale, one of the most significant figures in the post-World War II Philippines and then in Vietnam. The Road Not Taken not only tells Edward Lansdale's story with novelistic verve, but also situates it wonderfully in the context of his tumultuous experiences and offers important lessons for the present day. Max Boot, what an amazing accomplishment you've done, and I'm sure this is a work of love, and now you have to talk about it to us radio geeks, so I feel for you. Good morning, Max.
Thank you for having me on. It's a privilege to talk about it.
Well, it is our honor. And if I could just ask one technical question of you, please don't be ashamed or not ashamed. Don't be shy to tell me if there's echo, because I'm trying to figure something out here. So if you have an echo, I can maybe fix it. So anyway, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Who is Edward Lansdale? Who is that?
Edward Lansdale was this legendary American covert operative who was a former advertising man, worked during World War II in the OSS, the first civilian intelligence agency, and then after the war went to the Philippines, masterminded the defeat of the Huk Rebellion, this communist insurgency in the Philippines, and then went to Saigon in 1954 and helped to create the new state of South Vietnam. And later on, he became very much at odds with American policy in Vietnam because he opposed the Kennedy administration when they decided to overthrow his friend Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, which he predicted would be a disaster, which it was. And then he was at odds with the Johnson administration because they wanted to send 500,000 American troops to Vietnam and to bomb North Vietnam, and Lansdale warned, no, this was not going to work. You could not defeat the Viet Cong by bombing them into oblivion. You had to create a stable, legitimate, and popular state in South Vietnam, but his advice was ignored. And so that's why the book is called The Road Not Taken, because there was an alternative path that Ed Lansdale sketched out that we did not follow.
That right there, it says so much, and it answers a lot of, or at least it seems to take us to the answer to so many questions, is why did we even go there in the first place?
Well, there was, I think the dominant mindset in the 40s and 50s and 60s was the domino theory, this notion that if the communists took power in Vietnam, then it would be next Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. Pretty soon all of Asia would turn communist, and that was the mindset. And so American policymakers were determined to resist the communist advance. And Ed Lansdale was in favor of stopping communism too. He just didn't think that the way to do it was by sending large numbers of American combat troops. He really wanted to work by, through, and with the local people and to empower them to fight our enemies for us, which is a model that I think resonates in the present day as we think about how to fight the global war on terrorism.
Yeah, I think so. Is he proven right? Has history proven him right? It seems like people can now go to Vietnam for vacations. I mean, so was he proven right? Because that seems to be what changed things.
Well, that's true. I mean, there's been a long and winding path that Vietnam has taken where now it's kind of a market-Leninist country. It's got a reform model of communism. It's becoming a de facto ally of the United States against China. But it's taken, there's been a lot of pain along the way. There was the American War in which, of course, 58,000 Americans died and millions of Vietnamese. And there were the communist takeover, the killing fields in Cambodia, several million people killed. You had all the people in re-education camps in Vietnam. You had millions of boat people and hundreds of thousands killed. So there was an awful lot of pain and suffering before we could get to a better Vietnam today. And, it's possible, I think likely, in fact, that we would have avoided a lot of those horrible consequences, a lot of that death and bloodshed, if Ed Lansdale had been listened to more.
And there are a lot of detailed maps that people can visually see if they don't really want to read the words.
Yeah, I've got maps and I've got pictures, but I try to make the story as riveting as possible. I mean, it's not just a military history. There's also a big love story in here as well. Because I'm the first person to detail Ed Lansdale's relationship with this Filipino lady named Pat Kelly, whom he met when he went to the Philippines in 1945, and who became his longtime mistress and eventually his second wife after his first wife passed away. And they had a really intense romance, which was hidden for years. And I was the first author to get my hands on the love letters they wrote to one another.
Is that right?
It's a very moving tale of their relationship. So it's not just your standard military history.
And is that what got you into this story? Is that what it seems like that was his motivation for doing some of the things he did? Is it also your motivation for writing the story?
That wasn't my motivation. I mean, I wanted to write the story of Ed Lansdale before I knew that these letters existed.
Oh, really?
But certainly, when I tracked down Pat Kelly's grandchildren, the woman who became a second wife, and they said, "Hey, would you be interested in these letters we have in our basement?" I said, "Boy, would I!" And there's just tremendous insight into his inner psychology that nobody else has ever had, and so that's enabled me to tell the Ed Lansdale story in a way that it's never been told before.
It's really amazing that you were able to develop a trust from different people to continue on your research about this, because sometimes people have this attitude like they need to be leery of people, but you are genuinely interested in bringing the story to light.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not just interested, I'm just fascinated by it. I mean, Lansdale was such a complicated and contradictory figure. He was somebody who could be very idealistic and also very ruthless. In some ways he was very devoted to his wife and family, but also had this other woman that he was very closely involved with. I mean, there are a lot of nuances in his story, and it's just been fascinating to bring it to a wider audience.
Did he fulfill everything he hoped to fulfill in his lifetime, or did anything go left? Was anything left unfulfilled?
Well, he was most of his life's work was ruined and was for nothing. I mean, he was very frustrated because he kept warning against this massive American military buildup in Vietnam. He kept saying it wasn't going to work. General William Westmoreland was genuinely convinced that he could bomb the Viet Cong into defeat, that he could kill the Viet Cong faster and they could be replaced. And Lansdale warned, no, that wasn't going to work. You had to stand up a government in Saigon that would win the support and allegiance of its people, and he was ignored. And so, when he went home from Vietnam for the last time in the summer of 1968 after the Tet Offensive, he was feeling very much dejected, defeated, and demoralized. And he was not surprised a few years later in 1975 when North Vietnam invaded and conquered South Vietnam, and so many of his friends wound up as either inmates in re-education camps or as refugees and boat people seeking safety in the United States. I mean, he was devastated, and to the end of his days, he was haunted by the sense of failure and all these what ifs and might have beens of history. What if he had been listened to? So it was not from a professional standpoint, certainly his life did not have a happy ending.
But he had given the facts about the fighting in the Philippines, and you'd think somebody would have listened to him.
Well, he did have a great reputation coming out of the Philippines because he really masterminded the defeat of the Huk Rebellion, this communist insurgency in the Philippines in the early 1950s. and he did it without having a single American soldier committed to battle. And so this was one of the great Cold War achievements for the United States, and he was in great favor in the Eisenhower administration. CIA Director Allen Dulles was a great champion of his, and that's why he had a lot of support for his work in Vietnam in the 1950s. And then he initially had support in the Kennedy administration, but the Kennedys tasked him with running Operation Mongoose to overthrow Fidel Castro, and this was a mission impossible, and he didn't achieve it. And so then he lost the favor of the Kennedys and was left naked before his bureaucratic enemies, including the defense secretary and his own boss, Robert McNamara. And so, excuse me.
Oh, you okay?
And so, as a result of that, he was left defenseless before his bureaucratic enemies. And he, in the 1960s, in the Johnson administration, he did not have the same kind of high-level champions as he had under Eisenhower.
Wow.
And so he could not achieve what he'd achieved before.
What were the reasons why people or political people tossed him under the bus, to use a modern day expression? Why did they make him out to be somebody who did not know what he was talking about?
Well, that's a great question, and a lot of it had to do with the way he clashed with Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, former chairman of the Ford Motor Company, a guy who was enamored of numbers and, very academically accomplished. Lansdale was not so academically accomplished. He was a UCLA dropout, but he knew a lot about unconventional warfare in Southeast Asia. And the clash really was symbolized by a meeting that they had where, Robert McNamara called Ed Lansdale into his office and said, Ed, I'm trying to computerize the war in Vietnam. I'm trying to reduce all the variables into mathematical equations, and I wonder if you could help me with that. And Lansdale said, well, sure, Mr. Secretary, but you need to keep in mind the X factor. And McNamara started writing on his graph paper X factor and asked, okay, how do I calculate that? And Lansdale said, well, you can't calculate it because it's the feelings of the people about how they want to be governed. It's the sentiments of the population that's ultimately going to prove the decisive factor in this conflict. And, in hindsight, that's actually a pretty wise insight.
Yeah.
But McNamara just couldn't see it and dismissed Lansdale and thought that he was an idiot.
Oh, man. And what did it do for his career? I'm guessing that's the kind of thing that you wouldn't want if you were a military person.
Well, that was pretty much the end of his career. He was forcibly retired from the Pentagon as a two-star general at the beginning of November 1963, on the very same day, ironically, when his friend Ngo Dinh Diem was being overthrown by the South Vietnamese military in a coup supported by the Kennedy administration, and something that Lansdale had warned against. So that was really where everything went haywire in Vietnam. The war was Americanized. Ed Lansdale's advice was disregarded, and Lansdale was forced out into the cold.
This is such an extensive work. Max Boot is our guest. He's the author. This is a New York Times best-selling book. You quite frequently might hear us say we have an Amazon best-selling author. I don't know if it's any easier or not, but we don't have New York Times best-selling authors with their book quite often, so this is an honor. The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam is what I'm talking about. If you're looking at the podcast, the cover of the book is on there. I got it off of Amazon, where you're getting a lot of rave reviews, and of course the accolades that it's a New York Times best-selling book. When did this one come out?
It came out in January.
Oh, wow. It's brand new. Oh, my gosh.
Yep.
In all of the research that you did throughout the different countries, was there some information that was deemed classified that they kind of opened up to you and not others?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, I had a lot of newly declassified documents, a lot of CIA reports that Lansdale wrote while working for the CIA in the 1950s, for example, a highly classified memorandum that he wrote to CIA Director Allen Dulles after the 1953 Philippine presidential election, in which he revealed how he had masterminded the campaign victory of Ramon Magsaysay, his close friend and defense minister, who won the presidency of the Philippines in a landslide. I mean, this is all, pretty sensitive stuff, and it's taken many, many decades for it to be declassified, and I was lucky enough to become the first author who could make use of this newly revealed information.
Oh, my God. They couldn't have. It must have been a godsend to have you connected with this information. By the way, I do have some phone calls. Are you okay with taking phone calls?
Sure.
Okay. The book is, as I mentioned, a New York Times bestselling author. It currently is #1 in Kindle in the Vietnam War category, number 2 in books in the Vietnam War category, and number 3 in books of United States history Vietnam War category. So you've got number 1, number 2, and number 3.
Congratulations.
All right, let's squeeze in a phone call. Good morning. Thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Robin. And it's a pleasure and it's an honor to speak to you, Max Boot. Sir, I was just going to ask you, could you comment on the relationship that Lansdale may have had with Daniel Ellsberg? And Daniel Ellsberg, a former Marine Corps captain who served in the Korean War, for the listeners not knowing that. And then also, having been a Marine and wondering about the Vietnam War and other options and alternatives, like it seems like your book is trying to approach, Lansdale would be a person that I've actually heard of. But I looked at it through my Marine Corps eyes. I saw that David M. Shoup, who was John F. Kennedy's JCS, who had served in China in the late 20s, and then he served in World War II and got the Medal of Honor. Kennedy was told by David M. Shoup concerning Vietnam, do not put boots on the ground. And of course, John F. Kennedy was not a big fan of the Dulles brothers, did not care for Kennedy, but maybe one more than the other. I wonder if you could touch on any of that, sir, and then if you could touch on the resources that Vietnam had when it came to gold and platinum and tin and rubber plantations, and how it could tie into, our contemporary world, and just to take a look at what happened in Iran, and why we go to Iraq. But it just seems like we're there to take something that belonged to you and to then leave people that are puppets in place. So I appreciate you, sir. Thank you, Max Boot, for even listening to my stupid call.
Thank you for the call. He gave you a lot to respond to there, Max.
Yeah, great comments. Thanks for the call. I mean, first off, Lansdale and Dan Ellsberg, who was the Pentagon Papers leaker. I mean, I don't know if you saw the new movie The Post, but I was tickled to see it. And the very first lines of dialogue in the movie, one Marine says to the other, "Who's the long hair?" And the other Marine answers, "That's Ellsberg. He works for Lansdale at the embassy." And indeed he did. Dan Ellsberg got his start working for Ed Lansdale in Vietnam in 1965. And then subsequently, at that point, Ellsberg was a shoot-'em-dead super hawk, and then, of course, he became very dovish and leaked the Pentagon Papers, which greatly embarrassed Ed Lansdale, because a lot of the Pentagon Papers were about Ed Lansdale's activities in Vietnam in the 1950s. But Ellsberg and Lansdale remained on good terms, and I actually talked to Ellsberg in the course of my book research, and he told me, I loved Ed Lansdale, and I love him still. He had a lot of respect for Ed Lansdale, so very interesting and significant relationship that I read about in the book, among other things.
Wow. Is his second wife still alive?
At Lansdale? No, Pat Kelly, she's died. His children are still alive, Ted and Pete, who provided a lot of help to me on the book and provided the letters that Ed Lansdale wrote to their mother, right, often simultaneously with the letters that he was writing to Pat Kelly, his mistress.
Isn't that is fascinating. Now, for those who love reading books, that's the part I think that might attract the reader that wouldn't normally be attracted to a book about war.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a knuckle-dragging military historian, so I didn't expect to be writing this romance, but it was actually very moving. And there was a point in 1956 after a 10-year affair when Ed Lansdale was preparing to leave Asia and go back to Washington, go back to his wife and kids, and Pat Kelly wrote this letter to him breaking off their romance, which was very touching to me. I mean, I actually shed a tear while I was reading it. This was one of the low points of their relationship. So there's a lot of emotion there that you would not necessarily expect to find in a book about the Vietnam War.
You are quite an accomplished author. I'm looking at the list of books that you've written, and I mean, this is you. I mean, you are the guy to go to if we have any questions about military history, especially. When did this start for you? If I could just ask you about yourself for a little bit. Were you a little kid, and how did you become attracted to this topic so fervently?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not really sure. I mean, I've always been interested in history ever since I was a little kid, reading about World War II, reading about Winston Churchill. History has always been my passion. I was an undergraduate history major. I went to grad school in history. Then I got into journalism, and then I started writing books of history on the side, and eventually got hired by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a think tank in New York where I've been employed since 2002. And that, I'm not an academic, but it gives me an opportunity to basically be a full-time writer, and I can write these books of history, and I also write on current events. I'm a Washington Post columnist, but history is really my passion, and I really enjoy doing these kinds of narrative histories. And this is my first biography, hopefully not my last, because I really enjoy the showing the complex interplay of personality and larger events, and telling a larger story through the life of one man like Ed Lansdale has just been a tremendous eye-opening experience for me.
Well, you should be consulted from the psychological aspect. I mean, gosh, now we're just overrun with school shootings and just people coming out just wanting to kill people just because. And I think you would be a really, really good person for the powers that be to discuss these things with you to see what could be done to prevent them from happening.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think Ed Lansdale definitely has some lessons to teach for the present day, and especially in the way that he was able to get along with foreign leaders, using empathy and friendliness and establishing relationships of trust with people like Ramon Magsaysay and Nodin Ziem. I think that's something we need to do today. I think, too often we wind up alienating foreign leaders, even those who are inclined to be on our side, and I think he really showed how we can get along much better with them, and instead of issuing demands, really listening to them and being friendly with them and gently guiding them along the path that we want to go. We could really use some new Ed Lansdales today.
In the beginning of the interview, you sort of answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Robin and I have done radio for a very long time, and in the course of doing this, we've had a lot of Vietnam War veterans who have either called in or asked to be guests on the show, having written a book or not. They just come in and they have something to say. We're a local show, so it's really not a hard thing to say yes to. One of the things that comes up frequently, maybe a third of the time, is the belief that some of the veterans have, the Vietnam War veterans, that the war they fought was not for the purpose they were told it was for, that for one reason or another they believe it was about oil. What is your thought on that, and what do you think Ed Lansdale's thought was on that? And when I said you kind of answered this in the beginning, because it sounded like he was kind of on the same page as the official reason for being there, I'm wondering if that was completely true.
Well, we weren't in Vietnam for oil. I mean, that was a conspiracy theory that was actually spread by the communist side to undermine the American war effort. I mean, there was a lot wrong with the American war effort, but it wasn't motivated by any hunt for oil.
Okay.
It was really motivated by a desire to stop communism, fear of the domino theory that other countries would fall to communism, and especially Lyndon Johnson was haunted by the nightmare that if Vietnam fell, that Republicans would accuse him of being weak on communism, that he feared his presidency would be crippled like Harry Truman's was after the fall of China to the communists. He also had World War II analogies in mind, like Munich. He didn't want to appease dictators like the communists. So that was really, I mean, you can argue about whether those reasons were good ones or not, but those were really the reasons why we were in Vietnam. It had nothing to do with oil, because, this is kind of like in Iraq as well. I mean, if we were after the oil, there's a lot easier ways to get it, like just buying it instead of sending 500,000 troops and having 58,000 killed in Vietnam and spending countless hundreds of billions of dollars. That's not the way, that doesn't make any economic sense.
Thank you for addressing that. I just know that some of our listeners wanted that question answered. All right, I have a copy of this book. This is really epic. This is huge. 700-something pages. I got the hardcover copy of it. If you want the one that was sent to me, I will leave it aside here at the radio station. You can come pick it up. You have to ask now, though, and it'll be waiting for you. The rest of us do have to go buy it. I found it on Amazon. Do you have a website dedicated to the book?
I do have a website. It's www.maxboot.net.
Okay, let me squeeze some of these calls. Gosh, a lot of people want your book. Here we go. I pick one at random. Good morning. Turn your something down. But you've got the book. Who's this? Who is it?
This is Jim.
I can't hear you. You have to tell who you are. Turn your radio down. Can you tell me who you are? Oh, my gosh.
Oh, he's gone.
All right, whoever that was, I'm sorry, you didn't get it. I got to know who you are. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this?
Hey, Larry, it's Mark.
Mark, you got it. It'll be waiting for you here at the station, okay?
Yes, thank you very much. I've never gotten a book, and thanks again. Max, could you talk about David M. Shoup?
We don't have any time at all, Mark. We're absolutely out of time. But you got the book. Max, thank you for being on the air with us today and taking some time to speak to us about this, and good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate being on.
All right, you are welcome. All right, we will take a little break, and we will be right back. This is The Source, WOCA Ocala.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. He's quit the force, his house now under police guard, a deputy who stayed outside as someone shot and killed 17 people at a high school in Parkland, Florida last week. Broward County Sheriff Steve Israel says the deputy should have
went in, addressed the killer, killed the killer.
Teachers at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High are being allowed back into classrooms today to collect personal belongings left during the shooting. A Florida prison spokeswoman says